So now we're going to switch gears and start looking at our second unit, the institutions of government. So remember, for our purposes, there are three institutions of the federal government: the legislature, which is Congress, which of course has two branches, right? It's a bicameral legislature, so it has the House and the Senate. Then we have the second branch, the executive branch, which is headed up by the president. And we know we only have one president. It's a unitary executive. And it's going to be important to know why it's a unitary executive. And under this unitary executive, we have a bureaucracy. Our third branch is then the judicial branch. This is made up of the Supreme Court, and under that, the lower federal courts. So our first branch, the legislature, they make the laws, right? In our separation of powers, the legislature makes the laws. So how do they make the laws? Right? This process is different from the process of lawmaking under the Articles of Confederation. Right? The Articles of Confederation needed a supermajority to pass legislation and unanimity to make any amendments, and because the articles were drawn so narrowly, most major legislation actually had to be an amendment. Whereas in Congress under the Constitution, we know we don't need a supermajority in most cases, right? To just pass a regular old law, we need a simple majority, which is 50% plus one, in both chambers, the House and the Senate. And they each take a vote, and they must vote on the same version of the bill. So if the bill changes in either chamber, it has to go back to the original chamber to get revoted on. Now, there are times when we need a supermajority, right? That is when, for example, we are doing a veto override, when the president has already vetoed a bill that's been passed by a majority, and now it's back in Congress and they're trying to override the presidential veto. That needs a 2/3 majority. We also need a supermajority to pass amendments to the Constitution. But don't forget, those amendments then have to be ratified by a supermajority of the states. Now, what type of laws can Congress make? Right? They're granted powers in the Constitution, such as the power to print and coin money. They're also granted the power to regulate interstate commerce as well as international trade. They are granted as well the power to, I keep wanting to say the take care clause, the necessary and proper clause, or the elastic clause. That is what the legislature has, right? Which helps give them the power to do more than what the text of the Constitution says. Now, they do have other powers, enumerated powers, right? The Commerce Clause would be an enumerated power. They have others. So you should generally know these powers. They're listed on our original presentation about the legislature. They're also, to an extent, listed on our federalism slides under the powers of the federal government portion of that. So who serves in Congress? Well, we know that there are certain statutory requirements for who can run, and those are in the Constitution. But we also know that the people who run are not entirely representative of us, right? They tend to be older, whiter, and more male than the average American. They also tend to be more highly educated, and they tend to do certain types of jobs. There's a lot of lawyers, for example. There are not that many CPAs, which of course is somewhat problematic because the legislature, the House specifically, must originate all federal tax law. Now, what models of representation does the legislature follow? Right? This was Edmund Burke's two ideal sort of models of representation. We've got delegate model and trustee model. Delegate is basically doing exactly what your constituents want at any given time, whereas the trustee model is putting national needs before the needs of your individual constituents. Now, obviously, we know that Neither model is followed perfectly, though the House tends to be somewhat more delegate and the Senate somewhat more trustee. This is because the Senate was always intended to temper the sort of whims of the public in the House, right? It was the cooling saucer. Now, we know that lawmaking in the legislature is hard, right? I said it needs a simple majority, not a supermajority, but that's still not easy, especially because everything has to go through both chambers. Now, there's a lot of collective action problems in the legislature that we've talked about and that are highlighted on the slides from the 2 days on the legislature. But of course, we know things like the information costs, right? It's hard to know everything about everything you're dealing with. So we have tools like jurisdiction, committees. That also gives us motivation to learn things, to specialize in our committee's area, which we can then impart that knowledge on other people, and they'll trust us because we're on that committee, assuming we're in the same party, right? That's another structure in place for solving collective action problems. These political parties, which are sort of like teams. Now, currently, because of gerrymandering, right, that's the redrawing of congressional district lines with political motivations. Because of partisan gerrymandering, Republicans have a slight edge in the House. Just how the lines have been drawn, Republicans have a slight advantage. Now, we know currently that in the House, Democrats do hold a majority, right? So this advantage is not airtight, but it is still an advantage. They have an easier time winning seats. Now, the structure of... these are not the only collective action problems, by the way, you should know more. But the structure of the institution, right, the structure of how we've allocated seats, right, drawn the districts with gerrymandering, affects the makeup of the institution, and then the structure of the institution itself affects our lawmaking process, right? So we should know about structures like committees, procedures like the filibuster, and how we end the filibuster. The filibuster, of course, is only in the Senate, and we end it with a cloture vote. Cloture requires 60 votes. That's why a lot of the times people think that the Senate needs a supermajority to pass regular legislation, but in reality, they only need a simple majority. It's just they need a supermajority if they want to stop filibusters, and any senator can filibuster any type of legislation except a reconciliation bill. Reconciliation bills being the federal budget. We also know there's rules, right? Rules like the cloture rule, rules like when you can and can't filibuster. There are also closed rules, open rules, different things like that on debate. So we know that these different institutional structures can affect the lawmaking process.